Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk. So glad to have you back again this week. I have a guest I'm really excited about today, Jim Scarpace, good friend. We go back a while. But before we get into the conversation, just as always, I'd like to encourage you, please ask questions. It's not every day that we get a chance to talk with someone like Jim, ask him our questions. He has such an amazing vantage point on the construct of addiction, on the industry of treatment. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and I hope that you'll take part and join us. So that being said, let me just hit you guys with his credentials. So Jim Scarpace, he is the executive director at Gateway Foundation in Aurora, Illinois, and I think probably about like 7 other locations at this point. He is all over the place with Gateway. He has 28 years of experience in mental health, substance use, and criminal justice. He's also an assistant professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He's been there for 17 years. I always appreciate his opinion, and so glad he can join us today. So Jim, thanks so much and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for having me on. I'm excited as well. It's good to talk to you, and I'm excited about our topics.
Yeah. No, I think we're going to have a really thought-provoking conversation today. But before we dive in, so if you could, for the listeners who don't know you, where does your passion for addiction come from? And what are you up to these days?
Sure. My history is interesting when it comes to addiction and working with individuals who struggle with substance use disorder. I started working with DCFS wards with trauma histories back in the mid to late 90s, and working with those kids, with those adolescents, I saw a strong relationship between trauma and substance use disorder. A lot of them were using substances, alcohol, especially to self-medicate, feelings associated with not only their trauma experience, but, the after effects of that trauma and how it impacted their life, and really struggles with anxiety and depression and other mental health issues. And as a result of that, I saw a lot of those kids also get in trouble with the criminal justice system because of their substance use history, whether it be, getting in trouble due to, emotional issues associated with their substance use, like anger, that kind of thing. And they were getting in trouble, and really the issues required support, treatment, and counseling, not incarceration or criminal justice involvement. And so I worked a lot with the juvenile probation department in DuPage County back then. And we really identified that this wasn't just these DCFS wards, that it was really kids across the county, as well as young adults, that were struggling with this and getting in trouble with the courts as a result of substance use, especially alcohol use. And we developed a specialized program there called Probation Behavioral Health Services to really work with those individuals in a different way. And I think that was the foundation that started to stem the movement towards like drug courts across the counties, both for adolescents as well as for adults. And, as a result of that, I ended up moving over to probation in DuPage County and running that program. And then through my experience there, of course, worked a lot with Gateway Foundation and helping clients get into treatment as an alternative to juvenile detention or jail. And, my experiences with Gateway were so positive during that time that when an opportunity came to kind of step over to that side and do more work in terms of just helping people with this disorder and getting them the treatment they need, and most importantly, helping them achieve and sustain recovery, which we see every day here, I was all about that. So I moved over to Gateway in 2007 and been here ever since.
Yeah, you have such a unique perspective on all of this. And in particular, I know we're going to get to stigma a little bit later in the show today, but this idea of, the criminal justice system being an arm for change in that area and the pros and cons around that. I mean, I think that there's so many interesting intersections between like what's a good deterrent versus what's something that's stigmatizing and creating more problems than it's solving, particularly within this context of marijuana legalization that we've seen here both in Illinois and across the country. It's a really interesting intersection.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that being said, though, we're not marijuana, not our main topic for today, but we wanted to actually start with alcohol, which is kind of like, it's weird to say, but it's kind of like the forgotten addiction, because it's almost like we take it for granted because it's everywhere, and it's alcohol is everywhere, alcoholism is everywhere, to the point where people don't even bat an eye or even highlight the fact that we actually lose 88,000 people a year to alcohol-related death, which is more than we've ever had to opioids, which has been making headlines. People do talk about it. We've seen congressional action about it. So I guess, Jim, to start the conversation off, why do you feel like there's such this gap between the impact alcohol has on our society here in the United States and the amount of attention we pay to it?
Well, I think you hit on some of it. The reality of the situation and why alcohol is so dangerous and such a big issue in our society is mostly because it's so acceptable in our society. Unlike other substances, marijuana is a great example, which just recently has become legal in the state of Illinois, but it had been illegal for so many years. And many of the other substances that individuals struggle with have more connotations of negativity associated with them in terms of the general public's views, where alcohol does not. And, because of that, and because it's so accessible and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, the stats associated with it in terms of those who struggle with it and the outcomes of those individuals who struggle with it in terms of consequences is staggering. I mean, you mentioned 88,000 deaths a year. It's the third leading cause of death, preventable death in the United States. And that comes from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. I mean, I think another stat that's really just, mind-blowing is 40% of all hospital beds, according to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, in the United States are used to treat alcohol consumption conditions. 40%. I mean, we're talking about COVID right now and the amount of beds that are being filled, but think about that. When COVID comes and goes, this will still be occupying 40% of our hospital beds. And I think the other big stat that's just so astounding to me that's come out recently is, again, same organization, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, 25.8% of people ages 18 and older. And that breakdown is 29.7% of men and 22.2% of women report they have engaged in binge drinking in the past month. And binge drinking is 4 or more drinks in one occasion for a woman, 5 or more drinks for a man. The access is just everywhere. And if you're someone who doesn't struggle with an alcohol-related issue or an alcohol use disorder, it may be harder to wrap your head around the impact that this substance is having, not only on society, but on individuals and the dangers and consequences it can cause both medically, psychologically, and social emotionally.
Yeah, I kind of wonder. So, how do you feel about the phenomenon where it's like, because I remember back in college, right, where drinking is very much normalized, and I went to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Like many state schools, there's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of bars. It's the sort of place I remember thinking, like, you should not be able to go into a bar and die with a $20 bill. Like, alcohol should cost more than that. But like that's what was going on down there. But part of what the culture is as well is I feel like a lot of things that are legitimately disturbing are just like laughed off. Like people like getting in fights or falling asleep and play, like just dangerous stuff or property destruction, that it's almost like a fun story that you laugh about because it's paired with alcohol. Where do you think that comes from? Where we laugh about misfortune when it's paired with alcohol rather than actually take it seriously and be like, that's pretty just self-destructive behavior.
I don't know if you've ever heard of Brene Brown, but she has some fantastic quotes. And one of the quotes I like the most from her is, and she says this, she says, in order to empathize with someone's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it and not how you imagine their experience to be. And really that quote fits well with something I've said for a long time, which is perception is reality. People's perception of alcohol is impacted by so many things. One, it's a rite of passage for some people. They believe as you go to college, that's what you do. You go to college, you get an education, and you go to college to party and drink. It's encouraged by our society. You can't watch a sporting event without multiple commercials for beer pop up. It's it's normalized because there are people out there who will drink who will not have these negative consequences. But that is not as many people as you would be led to believe by our society and by our norms. I mean, the reality of the situation is 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 5. And this came recently out of county health rankings for both the collar counties around here, which are Kane, DuPage, Kendall, and Will. 1 in 5 adults report engaging in excessive drinking. And so, that's drinking to the point of intoxication, drinking to the point where either your liver or your body can't medically manage the alcohol appropriately, can't physically handle it appropriately, or psychologically, it starts to impair you in a way where you're not able to make good decisions. You may put yourself in higher risk situations. You may increase your depression. I think really what's happening is perceptions are distorted because experiences and norms have not been as accurate as they should be when it comes to alcohol. I mean, when you think about the media messages, we see a lot of media messages about the dangers of opiates, right? Prescription pain pills and heroin. Right now, there's a lawsuit against one of the major, pharmas that produce opiate painkillers. You don't see that stuff with alcohol. You don't see the implications, the consequences. Here at Gateway, of course, we see it every day. Alcohol use disorder is one of the largest substance use disorders that we treat, predominantly larger than opiate use disorder. When I look at our inpatient client population, people that require 24-hour care as a result of substance use disorder, 60% of that population on any given day is alcohol use disorder. I mean, it's a substantial issue. And it goes back to that perception piece. If you don't know someone who struggles with it, or you've not struggled with it yourself, it's really easy just to shake it off and be like, it's fun. It's wine o'clock somewhere. You see those sayings everywhere. Everything's just, alcohol's encouraged, partly because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and partly because there's a percentage of the population that can drink socially and moderately and be okay. So they don't know about this other piece.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a little bit of a parallel here around what's happened with COVID, where your chances of actually dying of COVID are actually quite low, but there's a certain percentage of people who will die from COVID, particularly if they're older. So we have this balance where we're having to actually say, you're not necessarily wearing a mask for you, you're wearing it for someone else's grandma or for them, we actually have to think about the impact on others. And so the vast majority of people, and we see the same thing here with marijuana, where the vast majority of people who drink or who smoke pot, it's not like they are going to have an addiction, but a certain percentage will. And when we create this climate of normalization where we glamorize getting high, when we glamorize getting drunk, that creates this permission structure for people to, go all Animal House when they get to college, and then that continues. You pointed that out as well. I think that we have these, rites of passage, like you mentioned, or customs at certain times or places in people's lives. But I think people don't realize you don't end up at Gateway, or you don't end up, seeing someone like me for individual therapy for addiction, just like spontaneously out of the blue. It's a progressive thing that might even start in college or start when you're a teenager and then grows for years.
Absolutely. I mean, we know there's such a strong genetic predisposition to alcohol use disorder, especially when you look at it compared to other substances, meaning the first time you have exposure, pick up that first drink. If there is a genetic predisposition, it's not a control or a willpower issue or whether you're weak or strong. If you have that disorder, that first drink is going to activate that genetic predisposition and you're going to start to struggle. You may not recognize it at first, as you said, but like you also said, it's not, hey, I start drinking today and tomorrow I have a problem. It's a progressive illness. And I would say that most people may ignore signs and symptoms of that illness until it gets progressively worse. And, even people today that are, drinking or engaging in drinking and hearing some of this, you have to start asking yourself, is this starting to become a bigger problem than even I'm willing to acknowledge it to be? Or have people in my life just accepted it? Or I've accepted it as just kind of who I am, or this is what happens when you drink. It happens to everybody like this. And so you ignore signs and symptoms that may be telltale of, hey, I may have a difficulty with this. This may be a medical issue. I may need some assistance, where you might not ignore other medical conditions. Like if you had a cough and a sneeze, especially right now during the pandemic, or a fever, you're going to reach out to your doctor and talk to them most likely and say, hey, I'm a little worried. I'm starting to have these symptoms. With alcohol use disorder, and we'll talk about this in a little while, with the stigma, it doesn't happen that way. So people hide it, or they ignore it until it gets progressively worse. And then that's usually when we start to see them at Gateway, or you may see them.
Yeah, well, and I think so. There's a couple interesting points that I want to highlight and then dive into. The first is that this is something that actually can be addressed earlier. I think there's a myth that you have to hit rock bottom in order to make a change in your life, and that's not necessarily true for any sort of behavioral issue, whether or not it's whether or not it's weight loss or insomnia or an alcohol use disorder. These are things actually that you don't have to wait until you've lost your family and your job and your house. Like you can intervene. You just have to have the motivation to do so. And ultimately, when we talk about rock bottom, that's what people are referring to, is that you have a tremendous amount of motivation because you feel like it's either change or die, or change or lose everything. The second part, though, that you touched on that I think is really important, particularly now, because alcohol sales are up 50% nationwide. I mean, all sorts of self-medication are way up during the pandemic. Is this question of what are the signs that drinking is starting to become a problem? So if either a listener or someone else in their life, in a listener's life, if they're wondering, like, what should people be watching out for as signs, like maybe I should consider getting some help for this?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Aaron. I think that, what we see, well, first and foremost, one of the things that we know about drinking is DUI rates are on the rise. And part of that right now is because of this pandemic, people have isolated more. They pulled themselves away from social supports because they've had to, due to COVID and just the concerns and risk associated with it. But because of that, alcohol use disorder and its progression has gone up exponentially. We are seeing individuals with more severe alcohol use disorder and related issues, mental health disorders and untreated behavioral issues that result in DUIs. 30% of fatal car crashes involve alcohol. We know that pre-COVID. Some current stats have suggested that that's gone up now substantially as well, that it may be up as high as 50% of the car crashes right now, because people are drinking more because they're not doing what they used to do pre-COVID. And as you start to look at that, you have to look at the signs and symptoms, as you said, and really identify what are things that I need to be aware of. And they're not things that are hard to determine or hard to identify if you're looking for them. So, for example, drinking longer or more than you intend to. That's a big one. I had one individual say to me, and this is so telltale about alcohol use disorder and the myths, is I don't even like the taste of alcohol. I just drink to get drunk because that's what everybody does. Again, that perception is reality. Is he didn't even like the taste of it, but he drinks to get drunk because the perception is that's what alcohol is for. You're supposed to get a little buzz. You're supposed to, impair yourself a little bit, or believing that it reduces your inhibitions so you can be more outgoing, when we know it's a depressant, and for a lot of people it just has the opposite effect. Trying to cut down or stop drinking but not being able to, really becoming dependent on alcohol. It becomes a part of your day-to-day activities, or maybe not day-to-day. I've had some people say, well, I don't drink during the week, I only drink on the weekends. So they binge drink on the weekends, get their alcohol levels up in their body, and then you can go without it for a few days, but then need to continue to drink, or they'll have substantial withdrawal symptoms. That's a telltale sign. And again, I think some of the myths are, I have to be drinking every day in large quantities to have an alcohol use disorder, and that's not true, but people believe that. Or having to drink more. The other big one is having to drink more to get the same desired effect, whether you're managing depression or anxiety, or to feel the way you used to feel. Now you have to drink more alcohol than you had to a month ago, or 2 months ago, or a year ago, because your tolerance has gone up. As I say that out loud, another great one that's a myth to me that always, concerns me is people will carry tolerance like a badge of honor, like it's a good thing. Like, I can drink a lot of alcohol and not get intoxicated. I'm tough, I'm strong. No, that means your liver isn't functioning the way it's supposed to function, and you're not having the warning signs or the red flag signs that your liver should be delivering to you, because your tolerance has increased in a way where your liver's not functioning properly. And a lot of times with tolerance, that's what's happening. And so And I think the other big one is, either avoiding family and friends when you're drinking, or family and friends that may have concerns, so you don't drink around them because they've made comments about your drinking pattern, or it's interfered with your relationships, or people have brought up that there's been concerns. And of course, the other one is having legal problems as a result of drinking. We talked about the DUIs. The one thing I would emphasize, just finishing up answering this, and I know I've been talking for a little bit, is around the fact that alcohol is one of the only substances we know of that you can die from stop using. Where other substances you can die from overdose. We've heard about opiate overdoses, but because alcohol use disorder has so many implications on both your brain and body, if you have a high enough blood alcohol level or high enough volume of alcohol in your system and you stop quickly, you can have seizures, strokes, cardiac arrest. And I don't think people understand that, and just the dangers associated with drinking large quantities. And we've seen it. We've seen it with binge drinking. We've seen college students die from it. No one is exempt from that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's alcohol, and then benzodiazepines are the other one that can kill you with withdrawal. So like your Xanax and Ativan and Klonopin and those sorts of things. But yeah, no, I think you were right on point with all of those things. I certainly, when people say like, do I have a problem? I always emphasize that you have to decide for yourself whether or not you have a problem, because problem is kind of subjective. But there definitely are some behavioral patterns and things that can disrupt your life that are signs that there might like objectively be some change physiologically that's happened in your body, or even subjectively some problems that maybe have grown slowly over time, so you haven't noticed that they've been getting worse, but they are pretty bad. I think, the only things that I'd add that I know that I like to use for helping people frame it is, why are you drinking? Because oftentimes the reason why people develop an addiction is they're drinking to cope, as opposed to just for fun or occasionally, or like occasionally socially. It's actually just started to become an everyday or nearly everyday occurrence to try to deal with your life, because we have to deal with our life in some way. But addictive substances grow, and they cause more problems at the end of the day, which is why we don't recommend it as health providers. The other one that I watch for, and you touched on this a little bit, is consequences. If people are having consequences in their life, like legal problems, but also health consequences or social consequences or work consequences, and they're still doing it, that speaks volumes about someone's relationship to it. That they can be caught. It can be like, say, getting in the middle of them and the people they love, or their job, or values that they used to hold pretty tightly to. Now all of a sudden they're saying, well, I don't know about those values anymore because I need to drink, or I need to use some other substance. Like that, to me, those are the red flags that I look for. I don't know if that's the same for you.
Absolutely. And I think as we see more severe alcohol use disorder present itself at Gateway, one of the other big signs for people is that as they stop drinking, they start to experience physical symptoms like shakiness or tremors or sweats. And so they almost need the alcohol to avoid those withdrawal symptoms. And when you get to that point, really you need to be calling right away because your symptoms are severe. And a lot of people, I think, again, shake off some of the symptoms prior to that until it gets to a point like that. And as you said, the earlier that we can intervene, for example, your Gateway, we'll talk about this in a little bit. We have a specialized program for alcohol. The earlier we can intervene, the better chances there are for someone to be able to get a handle on this illness and be able to manage it and being able to, maintain recovery from it.
Yeah. So before we get to the active treatment, I want to touch for a second on medications for alcohol, because this is something where a lot of folks that I work with are surprised, or they've never heard about medications, or maybe they've only heard one. But that we actually do have medications that can help in people stopping drinking or cutting down drinking if they don't necessarily want to stop. So I was wondering, would you be willing to share the ones that you use most at Gateway, and then also the paradigm around them as it interacts with this idea that sometimes is present in more traditionalist circles, that you're not really sober if you're using medications to help. I know we've talked about that a bit with opioids, but this is an issue with alcohol as well. So could you give us your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think going back to that paradigm or that idea that, with medications, it's not really recovery or you can't really be sober. Again, myth. It's a myth that people have held on to for a long time as a belief structure because of older thinking, traditions, but really, we can't even hang our hat on that. Because in 1956, the American Medical Association put out an article that said alcoholism is an illness, a disease of the brain, a medical condition that can be treated and that should be treated holistically with both medication and therapy. 1956, here we are in 2020. I always joke that if technology moved as slow as some of our treatments or our beliefs around substance use disorder, we'd all be listening to 8-track tapes right now. Maybe not. We might not even have gotten to 8-track tapes yet, because think about how many years have passed since 1956 and people still don't really believe it the way they should. They don't believe that alcohol use disorder is a medical condition like heart disease, like cancer, but that can be treated. It's a treatable medical condition. And just like those other medical conditions, medication can be such a key component to being successful in managing it. And it's about, and when we talk about stigma, it's just about stigma. It's about distorted perceptions and beliefs. And because this is a disease of the brain, and because it's a disease of the brain, it impacts behavior. People mistakenly believe it's about willpower, or it's about strength or weakness, or it's about moral character. And it's not about any of those things. It's about treating this as other medical conditions. So the medications that are out there that we've seen a lot of success with when it comes to alcohol use disorder are Camprel. Camprel is a medication that really helps individuals manage the cravings and early cravings associated especially with early withdrawal from the substance, from alcohol in this case. We've seen that to be very effective. And it's a pill. You take it once a day like you would take a cholesterol medication or a blood pressure medication. And it makes a huge difference in the recovery process or the potential for recovery. The other one is Naltrexone, or Vivitrol is the trade name. And that's an injection that people can get that will stay in their system up to 28 to 30 days. And it also manages the cravings and some of the withdrawal symptoms associated with alcohol use disorder. Both these medications are non-addictive, so you don't have to worry about developing a secondary addiction to, and I know some people worry about that because they worry about, oh my gosh, I already have an alcohol use disorder. Now you're going to put me on medications. What if I become addicted to those? That's not the case with these medications. And so, what we've really encouraged constantly as we have people come into treatment, and part of it's about education, really educating them on information, on facts, on data, but helping them to understand, because of, and not just them, but their families. Because if a family doesn't support someone being on medication, it's really hard for that person to stay on meds. So we want to educate the families as well about the importance of this and making sure families really understand this the way you and I are talking about it, because they have to become experts. If they don't become experts in their loved one's recovery, they're going to put up barriers unknowingly, unintentionally, that are going to interfere with that person's ability to stay sober or to achieve recovery. So as far as MAT goes, MAT's medication-assisted treatment, Gateway supports that wholeheartedly for alcohol use disorder as well as other substances, because again, our tagline is addiction medicine saving lives, and this is a medical condition and we have to treat it that way.
Yeah. Well, definitely. And I know this is a subject that I'm very passionate about. Back when I was directing the program at Linden Oaks, I would go to the detox unit once a week and make sure, when I did a group on the detox unit a week, and we would talk about medications, because even in the detox unit, sometimes it wasn't brought up and people didn't know that these options were out there. One other little interesting tidbit about naltrexone I want to put out there. Naltrexone not only helps with the cravings, but it also makes it so that you don't feel the pleasure of drinking as much as you otherwise would. It's actually a kind of an interesting effect. And so what we found is that people, if they're trying, say, to cut back as opposed to stop drinking, sometimes if they're on the naltrexone, they might have a couple of drinks, but instead of go all the way as much as they would have, they'll realize, wait a second, this doesn't even feel good. This isn't in line with my values. This isn't what I want. And so clinical studies have shown that they tend to drink less if they do choose to drink. The one other med, we don't see it as much these days, but I feel like I just want to throw it out there so that people know about it if they're not aware, is Antabuse. And I know that you're smiling about it. So Antabuse, for those who don't know, it is a medication that interferes with an enzyme in your stomach that metabolizes alcohol and stops it at this point that basically makes you extremely nauseous. And so if you're on Antabuse and you drink, you will vomit violently. It will be extremely unpleasant. I've heard stories of people will literally pass out while vomiting and then wake up. I mean, it's really bad. You will only drink on Antabuse once. And so what it does is it basically puts this buffer between you and drinking for a day or two. So that if you have the intention to stop drinking and you start to notice, wait a second, I think I'm going to relapse, it just gives you a little bit more time to catch yourself and get back on track before that relapse actually happens.
Yeah, and the only reason I didn't bring up Antabuse, and we do use it occasionally here, is one of the things we've seen with Antabuse over the long term is for someone who has a mild substance use disorder, if you will, or maybe on the cusp between mild and moderate, Antabuse can be effective. The problem is, when you have a moderate to severe substance use disorder and you're managing the psychological components associated with the illness and what Antabuse does, many people, because they can just stop taking it, might have a negative reaction, but then just stop taking it. And we're really not, shifting the ability to manage cravings and triggers the way we are with some of those other medications as they're going through the treatment process. So I think Antabuse has its place, and I would never discourage it, but looking at where someone is on the continuum of the alcohol use disorder helps us dictate when it's better to use Naltrexone or Camprel as an alternative.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of choices, and you've got to make sure it's not a one size fits all. But let's talk before we pivot to stigma, which is, I know, a really important subject for you. You're known around the Chicago area for being a champion in that area. I want to talk just for a second. So Gateway, you are kind of unique in that you have an alcohol specific treatment wing. So could you talk a little bit about... Ooh, we had a little gap there, I think.
Yeah, a little break, but I'm glad you're still here. That's good.
Me too. That would have been really awkward. Really awkward if we both went off the air. All right. Wi-Fi, don't fail me now. But program, what do you do differently in that unit? And why should someone who needs treatment be thinking about going to a program that has a specialty alcohol specific treatment arm?
Hopefully you can still hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, we call our program the Recovery Advantage Program, and we specifically named it that because we really want people to have an opportunity, especially with alcohol use disorder, to start to tackle some of the unique situations and experience that come with the illness, both from a medical standpoint, so really having nurses and doctors that can help target some of the medical concerns or co-occurring conditions that may occur with alcohol use disorder, as well as from a psychological and social standpoint, because, psychologically, as we talked about, alcohol use disorder is a type of illness where people don't seek help for it right away, like they might with other substances. And so as we start to see those individuals, they may be, have progressed not only in age, but in their career and their development. And they, may be coming forward at a point in their life where they really just need different treatment approaches and different case management support than someone, let's say, that's in their early 20s with an opiate use disorder. Not that there can't be people in their early 20s with severe alcohol use disorder, because there are. But we really identified that we needed some specialized programming and treatment to really help that individual with an alcohol use disorder navigate and kind of deal with the different challenges and issues that present in their life as a result of the illness. And so we developed a specialized program to really give people somewhere to go where they can feel like, okay, yes, I have an alcohol use disorder. Yes, it's different. It's a different experience for me than maybe someone with an opiate use disorder, but I'm also not alone. There are other people who struggle with this, and Gateway is wanting to welcome those individuals with an alcohol use disorder to come to our program and know that, yes, you're not alone. Yes, there are other people struggling with this. And yes, we have a specialized program that can really help target some of the issues you're experiencing right now. And so that was a big reason for making that differentiation and starting the program. And again, as I said earlier, when we talk about severe alcohol use disorder and the need for residential care, it's a big issue in our society. We see that more than any other substance here in Aurora.
Yeah, absolutely. I think nationally, alcohol is easily the top what's being treated, and then marijuana right below that. Certainly outpatient marijuana is right below that. But yeah, your point is really well taken. That there's even, we'll call it like subcultures, different subcultures around different substances, different rituals around certain substances. And while there's certainly a lot of generalizable treatment angles as well as processes that go on biologically and behaviorally around a lot of different addictions, there are specific elements where someone who's dealing with an alcohol use disorder might not really relate so well to someone who's primarily using opioids or primarily using cocaine. And so there's definitely value there. But I want to make sure we get to stigma. I want to make sure we get to trauma, because these are such important topics, and time just flies by when we talk. Jim, I don't know how that happens. But so let's talk about stigma. So stigma and addiction. This is a really, really important topic. You and I actually, a couple years ago, were thinking that we wanted to publish a paper on this, and we just never could make the time actually to write about it. But because we honestly felt, and still do, I think both of us, that stigma is literally killing people right now when it comes to addiction, even though it's something that I think oftentimes is thrown in as like an add-on, or like we're going to do, like in policy, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this, and we should also reduce stigma. It's like the little thing on the end. But you and I are both believers that it should be far more central, and there are really important reasons for that. So could you share a little bit about your views on stigma, what it looks like around addiction, and why it's so important?
Absolutely. And you touched on it, right? Stigma in a lot of cases is on the far end of the bell curve when it should be up in the front. Because at the end of the day, stigma is the ultimate barrier that stopping people from who needs help from getting it, so to speak. Sorry. And it also kills because of that shame or that fear, or that embarrassment that shouldn't be there for a medical condition that's been designated as a medical condition since 1956. You would think stigma shouldn't be there around alcohol use disorder, but it is, and is one of the strongest barriers, especially for people with alcohol use disorder, more so than other substances, because it's so acceptable, as we said earlier, that people don't come forward. They don't get help because they're ashamed, or they're embarrassed, or they think I should be able to handle this, or they believe everyone does it. Everyone drinks to get drunk. That's just how it is. And so they don't come forward, and because it's encouraged by their family and their friends to drink. And that's how they socialize, is through alcohol. Someone with this disorder, because of stigma, will not talk about it. Or if they start to talk about it, they get shut down. Or worse, they get a label slapped on them, which no one wants. No one believes they're an alcoholic, quote unquote. No one wants to have that label associated with them. So even if they're struggling with alcohol, and maybe struggling with it enough to have an alcohol use disorder, they don't talk about it. And one of the great examples I always give when I do trainings, Aaron, is my dad now died of prostate cancer 6 years ago. And every year I get a test to make sure that, my levels in terms of my prostate, and you can get this test in blood, a blood test, are okay. And so let's just say, for argument's sake, I went in this year and my test was not okay, and it was abnormal. And the doctor said, Jim, I'm worried it might be early stage prostate cancer, but I want you to see an oncologist. And I was nervous and I was scared, but I agreed to go in that oncologist's office because, of course, I wanted to treat this as quickly as I could. And I went in that oncologist's office, again, nervous, scared, worried, afraid. And he looked at my chart, he looked at me, and he said, Jim, I see you're here because you're cancer. Let's talk about that. He would never say that to me. And if he did, I would be taken back, either angry, shocked, confused. He would never identify me by my cancer. But I ask people 25 years why you're here. And how many times do you think I'm here? I'm here because I'm an alcoholic. If this is who you are, even if the label has good intentions, again, going to perception versus reality, even if it comes from 12-step and it has good intentions, if you believe this is who you are, instead of an illness that you're struggling with, it you can manage and overcome in terms of achieving recovery, that's a different mindset than this is who I am. Or worse, this can't be who I am. I'm not an alcoholic. My perception of alcoholic is this, and that's not who I am. So I don't come forward and I don't get help. So stigma associated with this illness is not only a huge barrier, but really I strongly believe is the difference between life and death in terms of someone getting treatment or not. And it's why it's so important that when we're out in the community, we're using the right language, and that we're encouraging or redirecting people who are using the incorrect language or not the appropriate language to change their mindset. Because that person who comes to my office and says, I'm here because I'm an alcoholic, didn't wake up one day with that language. Someone gave it to them, either the media or a family member, or worse, a professional with good intentions who said, you are an alcoholic. And we have to change that, because that interaction with that professional may be the last time someone comes forward if they hear that word. Maybe the last time they actually try to get treatment because they're embarrassed or ashamed. We got to change it. And if we don't change it, basically we're limiting people's opportunity to get help, and we'd never do that with any other medical condition.
Yeah. The words matter so much, and I'm glad you brought up the aspect of this that's tricky, which is that some people do self-identify as their disease and want to, or they view it as equivalent to taking ownership for a problem. And I think that the issue is that there's a big difference between saying I have a problem and saying I am a problem. And alcoholic and addict in particular, those are actually not reclaimed terms. These aren't things that are people have positive associations about. Even people suffering from those conditions. This is an exercise we actually do in treatment. I'm sure you do it at Gateway as well, where you put the word addict on the board and with a group, and you have just free association. People put up there what words come to mind, what descriptors come to mind when you think of an addict, and then you erase it. Then you put up instead person in recovery, or even person with an addiction, right? And immediately the whole vibe changes, and it demonstrates to some people why, for many people, it's very counterproductive to see yourself as an addict versus seeing yourself as a person in recovery. But these words are everywhere. I'm sure you and I have been at so many of these meetings, even right up until, I guess they're not as many now with the pandemic, but we're very well-meaning people, very well-educated people will, even when talking about stigma, will turn right around and say something about addicts. And sometimes they'll catch themselves, but it's like they can't help themselves. It's so hardwired into people's brains.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, if someone goes to a meeting, 12-step meeting, and wants to identify themselves as an alcoholic, good for them. I'm not discouraging anyone from doing that or saying they shouldn't. But what that term means to that person who may be in a different point in the recovery process than what it means to someone who's not in recovery at all, or is just trying to wrap their head around what they're struggling with, is just so different. And the connotations, as you said, associated with those labels, even though in 12-step meetings can be very positive, in a lot of other outlets are not. They're negative. And most importantly, which has worried me because of my criminal justice background, is the impact it has on people who get in trouble with the courts, and how judges and attorneys take those terms and use them incorrectly. And people end up serving time in detention centers or jails when they need to be in treatment centers, getting help like they would with other medical conditions. And when I was in probation, I saw a lot of that. I saw young men and women being detained for things that had nothing to do with criminal acts or criminal behavior. A great example is I worked with a young man who got put on probation for 5 years for a residential burglary. He stole a bicycle from an attached garage at 15 years old. Because the garage was attached, that was residential burglary. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't be, but I'm saying that was the nature of his crime in its entirety. Over the next 5 years, he received 22 indirect criminal contempt charges in the courts, not for committing new crimes, but for either testing positive for marijuana or testing for alcohol. He had an alcohol use disorder and a marijuana issue. The 18th time in the course of that 5 years, which is about 4 years and 6 months into his probation, that he tested positive, despite us trying to work with him and get him into treatment as probation. And I recommended it to the court at that time that the judge dismiss his charges because he hasn't committed a new crime. This is a treatment-related issue, and we need to help him, and we're not helping him by continuing to bring him back for criminal contempt for testing positive for marijuana or alcohol. Right. The judge and the state's attorney said, no, you are, this is a slap in the face to our criminal justice system. You're disrespecting our rules and the orders and the laws of the county, and sentenced that young man to the Department of Corrections for the 18th indirect criminal contempt for alcohol use and marijuana use only. No criminal charges. And we'll talk about trauma in a minute. That young man had a substantial trauma history. 2 months into his stay in the Department of Corrections, he hung himself. Those are the kinds of things that stigma can lead to. And again, I'm not blaming that judge or state's attorney. They were doing their job the way they believe their job should be done based on their perceptions of this disorder and the terms associated with it. But it doesn't matter why. At the end of the day, a disservice was done that resulted in a young man losing his life. And that's what stigma, when I say stigma kills, that's a great example of stigma can kill. And we as a society have to do better. There's really no excuses. Going back to that cancer example, if my PSA test was high in terms of numbers, and that doctor said to me, Jim, I have bad news. You have a dirty PSA test. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, it's dirty. I'm like, what are you talking about? He would never say that to me. But here we are in a society saying this is a medical condition, a disease of the brain, and we still use terms like clean and sober, or either you have a clean or dirty drop. All we're doing is hurting the people who need our help when we're doing those kinds of things. And it's unfortunate, but I'm hope it's starting to change. 12-step meetings are changing. Instead of saying, hey, I'm Jim and I'm an alcoholic, and everyone says, hi, Jim, and Jim tells a story. Now some meetings are saying, hi, I'm Jim and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I haven't used alcohol since I was 17. Recovery is giving me a gift of a new life. That's a different experience. And I'm hoping that starts to spread more. I really am.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you make so many good points here about the language we use, the way we perceive this medical condition, because you're right. Like the kid you were talking about, right? That's a symptom of a disease, right? If you have an addiction to cannabis, if you have an addiction to alcohol, that would be like punishing someone with diabetes for a blood sugar that's, you know what I mean? Like this is the disease, right? And we view it as either like a moral choice, like a choice of some sort, or something moralistic or criminal, but we actually know that it impacts the wiring in the brain once you're at that point. And we have to have compassion for it. But that said, most of us are not judges. Most of us don't have that platform. And so I think that one area where you and I agree very much is that the way that we can all positively impact this issue of stigma and addiction is with our language. And so you've been over a few different things today where we've talked about some stigmatizing terms. If you could give us maybe like your top 3 or your top 5, what should people avoid saying? And what could they say instead that would be consistent with either true medical nomenclature or what we call person first language, which is not saying disease first. So someone's a person with a problem versus being the problem themselves.
Right. And that's a big one, right? Alcoholic and addict versus a person with a substance use disorder, or a person with an alcohol use disorder. Those are big. I mentioned clean and dirty. You're not clean and dirty, right? You're either positive for a substance or negative for a substance. If you do a urine screen or a blood test, those got to go. Abuse, DSM took abuse out of its vernacular or language, if you will, because it recognized that, that term emphasized choice. You think about physical abuse, sexual abuse, substance abuse. They didn't go together. And so really getting rid of abuse. And with that comes things like, a lot of people say, what is your drug of choice? That term needs to go. You're not choosing to use or choosing to abuse substances. It's a disease. And so there are choices. Don't get me wrong. There are choices like with any medical condition, whether or not you follow recommendations from treatment or follow medication recommendations, but you're not choosing to use a substance if you have a substance use disorder or choosing to abuse it. So those
it's not like you're looking at like a cheese plate and being like, right, I'll take that. No,
it's not like you order it. Like I ordered a disease, so to speak. Yeah. Absolutely. And, I think the other one that is just really important overall is really staying away from negative connotation language. Things like junkie or I hear elky, or you hear all these slang terms that I've even heard some professionals use them in a way to try to relate to the client because they're using them. But as professionals, we need to use the correct language. If someone says, like I'm using Mary Jane, for example, as a connotation for a substance, you as a professional need to use the correct language for that substance to be able to teach them, what this is and what it isn't, because their connotations come with a lot of distorted perceptions. And we want to teach them about this condition the right way. So those are the big ones for me.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think you hit the ones that I'm most passionate about as well. Abuse is such a violent word. Other ones that pothead, stoner,
right.
Even the word shooting up in terms of injecting, right? They're all these very violent terms. And actually, there's been studies that have shown that using these terms, even in clinicians, people who are in treatment programs, tends to increase these stigmatizing attitudes that people are deserving more of punishment than of recovery, which blew me away when I saw that study. I think it came out a year or two ago. But I guess before we move on to trauma, I'll just cap this off by saying, be careful with your language, guys. If those who are watching this, it's so easy to use this, and the way that we get change is person by person. So hopefully we can all move on from this. And you might have noticed nowhere in this conversation has Jim or I said those words outside of context, or even the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse, where there's a petition right now to rename it.
Right.
So we'll see where that goes.
The other thing I'd add is that for those of you that are counselors or clinicians or psychologists listening to this, if you look at the DSM-5 and you look at the definition of substance use disorder, you'll see a lot of medical terms. You'll see a lot of information that supports the medical model, but you will not find the word alcoholic or addict in that book anywhere, because that's not a medical term, and as professionals, we shouldn't be using it.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. 100% agree. So we've got about 10 minutes left before we're done for today. So let's talk about trauma. And the reason we're talking about trauma is that it often overlaps with addiction. When someone's addicted to a substance, 99% of the time, in my opinion, they're using it to cope with something heavy. They're struggling to deal with something in their life. It could be internal, like trauma or depression or anxiety. It could be external, with just tremendous amounts of stress and trying to cope. But there's something that drives it. So from your estimation and from the data, Jim, why is there such a close connection between traumatic events and people engaging in addictive behaviors?
Well, according to SAMHSA, one of the things we know is 80% of clients with a substance use disorder have some kind of trauma trigger. And usually that's because for a lot of individuals, not all, but for a lot of individuals who struggle with a substance use disorder, that usually is brought on initially by a trauma experience that maybe have led them to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol as a way to cope with that trauma. Those feelings of shame or anger or guilt or fear, all of those things are associated with trauma disorders. And so individuals may start using substances as a way to manage those feelings, and then over time start to develop a substance use disorder as a result of that. And so, we see this also very often at Gateway. Many of our clients who come in that require intensive outpatient services or residential services really need trauma treatment. And the terminology for that has changed over the years. It's really gone from trauma informed, which means counselors are familiar with trauma and trauma treatment and approaches to help individuals with trauma, to trauma responsive, meeting the individual where they're at, getting information and data up front. One of the things we do here at Gateway is we use the ACEs. I know you're familiar with that, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, because we know a lot of trauma for some individuals happened years and years ago in their life, and the substance use is piled on top of other issues that have really led to the trauma not being processed or ever dealt with, or maybe even never talked about. And we know the longer from when a trauma experience happens until it's actually dealt with or worked through or processed, the harder it is to unravel it in terms of all these things get piled on top: unhealthy relationships, substance use disorders, mental health conditions. And so at Gateway, it's really important for us to treat those things together as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talk a lot about addiction being a biopsychosocial problem with a biological leg, a psychological leg, and a social leg. And certainly trauma is huge for that. I think for me, and I spent 3 years in the VA system training. And so we saw a lot of PTSD there and a lot of addiction there. And the part of the overlap, from my estimation, is that avoidance is part of the pathology of trauma. You do not want to there's this intense aversion to getting triggered to think about your trauma because you have this intense fight or flight response. And so you can potentially avoid the external triggers by avoiding those triggers, but you also have this internal trigger that is your memory. And so when you stop, or when life goes too slowly, or you have time to think or the ability to think, your mind goes to the trauma and it just creates this really vicious cycle. And so people either, I've seen people like work themselves to death, just go, 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 so they don't have time to stop, but then it gets them in their dreams. But then if that's not how they're living, a lot of times like the only way they feel like they can get peace is by numbing out in some way. And it's unfortunate because it actually perpetuates the cycle, but it feels like a short-term solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we found here is it's just so important to not be afraid to talk to people about trauma experiences. I think as clinicians, sometimes we're always thinking, oh, if we start talking about trauma, we're opening a Pandora's box that we can't shut, or there's these, again, myths like substance use disorder. There's myths with trauma that we're going to create false memories, which that's a hypnosis thing. That's not going to happen in processing. And it's so important that people are able to tell their story, not just the traumatic experience, but the story of recovery from that traumatic experience. These are survivors, and they need to be, they need to feel like they're being inspired. And really that's our job, is to inspire people, to help them feel like they can manage these issues. As you said earlier, as I said, this isn't who they are. This is something that has happened to them or something they're struggling with. And at Gateway, we really want to help, inspire as much as possible that belief that recovery is possible, not only from substance use disorders, but from trauma. And, the more we can do that, and, using components of evidence-based practice like DBT and CBT and mindfulness, helping people to do trauma narratives and be able to talk about their experience and the recovery process from it is just so important to the recovery, not only from trauma, but of their substance use disorder.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another really important concept, that you can recover from trauma. This is something where some people come before they actually go through an evidence-based treatment for trauma. They've been living with symptoms of PTSD for years. Maybe they've even thought that they can't get better. And that's part of why they were numbing out. Like, these are my choices. Either I'm drunk or I'm plagued by visions and nightmares. And there's absolutely alternatives to that. But sometimes it takes people either a while to find them, or the act of moving towards those memories and towards that trauma is just so aversive that they don't feel like that they can handle it. And so they end up backing away. And there's also, I guess, to link back to our second subject, there is this stigma around it as well. This idea like, I shouldn't be having this reaction, or like my trauma isn't as bad as someone else's trauma, or trauma is just for war veterans, or these sorts of things where people either disqualify themselves or discredit themselves, when actually, no, like what you're experiencing is real. It happens to people. It's like a natural thing. It's not like you're failing and that's why you have PTSD. Like it's like a coin flip. The data says it's a coin flip. You go through a traumatic experience, a 50% chance you end up with PTSD, 50% chance that you don't. There's some factors that might make it a little bit more likely or less likely, but it's not a personal statement. And I think that's essential too, that people recognize that.
Yeah, and if again, professionals who are listening, not being afraid to talk about it, because when you don't talk about it, either because you're worried, or again, going back to that Pandora's box idea, the message the person gets who's experienced a trauma is either it's not important, or maybe they did something wrong. And even if our intentions aren't that, when we avoid the conversation or gloss over it, especially when they're starting to share, we run the risk of sending just the exact opposite message of recovery that we want to send. And the harm's already occurred to them. That's in their past. It's the healing that needs to occur. And healing can't occur until someone can process those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are right at the top of the hour. So, Jim, is there anything else that you'd like to say to our audience today before we call it a day?
Just that if you are listening to this and it resonates with you or hits home, or you have a family member or you yourself are saying, hey, I may need help with this. This is bigger than I understood, or now I understand that, help's possible. Reach out. At Gateway Foundation, we have a 24-hour helpline. It is 877-505-HOPE or 877-505-4673. Our website is gatewayfoundation.org. We're here. We've been here for 50 plus years. We're going to be here. We're across the state of Illinois. So if we can help you, reach out to us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gateway, I've worked with them for years. They are a fantastic organization. Jim, I think, has shown his colors today as well as being someone trustworthy. Reaching out to him is always a good idea as well. And certainly, I think anyone who's my audience normally knows that I'm very accessible. So if you ever have questions, just DM me on any social media platform, reach out to me over email, and we'll make sure that you're taken care of. So thank you, Jim, for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure talking to you as always, Aaron. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We hope that we'll be able to see you next time. I think we have another show coming up in a week or two. So until then, take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day.